Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Happy Confident Company, who provide clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programs to help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. Visit www.happyconfident.com to find out more. Enjoy the podcast.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, the late show with Mr. B Teach, who will be joining us imminently. Just before he does, thank you very much for clicking play on this if you're listening back to it. This show is brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. They offer clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programs which can help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. Really recommend checking them out on the website www.happyconfident.com. Well worth checking out. And if you're interested in wellbeing across a whole school, then they're a fantastic company to look at. Just going to invite John in now, and then we will get started.
Hello, welcome to the Late Show with me, John B. It's lovely to be back after 2 weeks, and I am so excited tonight to introduce someone who I've had the pleasure to work with and learn lots from, to do with maths and things outside of the world of maths as well. I'm so proud to introduce Kate Henschel, who's going to be joining us tonight and speaking with us. So without further ado, I'm going to ask if Kate can join us and just kind of give us an introduction, a little flavour into her experiences, an overview of your career, Kate, and kind of everything that you're involved with at the moment. Hi, Kate.
Hi, John. Lovely to speak with you, and thank you for welcoming me on tonight's show. I feel like that's quite a simple question, but actually probably could go on for quite a long time. So this year, my role is Head of School Improvement for Primary Maths, and that's based within Trinity Multi Academy Trust. And within that, we have an external initiatives branch, which is outward facing. And in that kind of team sits numerous organisations, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to mention them. I'll promote them this evening, but they'll be very well known. And part of my role is looking at supporting schools, thinking about how they can improve mathematics. Kind of one of the large projects that we're involved with this year is supporting a local authority with schools and looking again at how they can improve mathematics. And I suppose previously to that, really, my career started as a teacher in the classroom up in the North East, so very close to where you are, and just had a love of maths whilst I was working up there. Gradually became a maths subject leader, and then embarked on looking at teaching for mastery, and was very fortunate that I could go and work with schools and support them to develop teaching for mastery. And really wanted to focus on that full time, and that's what brought me back home to Yorkshire. And there was an opportunity where I could do that, and was very fortunate that that's kind of where the journey took me, I suppose. Don't know if that was enough information, but yeah, short but sweet, maybe.
I was just about to introduce a new segment on what I was going to call Desert Island Desks. And it kind of came to me when I was listening to the radio a few weeks ago about kind of, which songs would people take to an island with them. And I was thinking, what kind of 3 things would I take to an island as a teacher? What are kind of my 3 absolute fundamentals? And I guess what I came up with, my top 3 would be number 1 would be obviously something linked with maths, because it's really my passion. Would be perhaps a Reckon Rick to take with me. Number two would be a whiteboard marker pen, although I guess I am assuming that I would take a huge whiteboard with me, and actually there would be people on a desert island to teach, but there we are. And the third one would be a copy of one of my favourite books, and I'm assuming I'm going here at Christmas time. It would be A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, Kate, I'm hoping that you've managed to get a little closer to your Wi-Fi, and I'm going to ask the same question to you. In the section now, I'd like to call Desert Island Desks. What three things would you take on your teacher desert island if you could?
Yeah, really good question. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit
We can
better.
hear you.
Is that easier now?
Thanks.
Oh, perfect. So I think I would definitely take something to play with, something mathsy. I know that sounds really geeky, but I quite often have something on my desk that is quite a useful distraction. So I'd probably take something like that. At the moment, I've got a wooden tangram, so that kind of keeps me occupied when I'm trying to figure something out or just have a bit of a break.
Mm-hmm.
I'd take a book. I vary from reading books which I think would enhance my career and my knowledge and my expertise, but then also I do quite like a bit of a trashy novel, depending on where I'm going on holiday. At the moment, I'm just about to read I Can't Do Maths by Alf Coles, so I think that would probably go in my suitcase. And then, the third one, that's a really tricky one. I'm not quite sure what that would be really. Maybe something to write down with and to doodle and to kind of again keep me occupied.
Yeah, no, I'm with you with the geeky gimmicks and everything, Kate. My number one, I don't know if you could hear, but was actually a wreck, which which I guess isn't the most exciting. But actually, I was saying, I'm assuming that there's going to be people who could be there to teach and all the rest of it. Yeah, really just a little warm-up question, I suppose. Just before we dive in then with kind of the theme of this evening and what we're going to be talking about, I'm just going to bring a message from our sponsors. So this program is brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Their clinically approved, ready to go wellbeing and mental health program will help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. You'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit them at www.happyconfident.com. Okay, let's dive in, Kate. I mentioned when we've been talking prior to the show, when we were kind of getting ready for it, that was going to be really math focused to fit in with your experiences and your career. So I guess question one really is around what you think the key features of an effective national curriculum are with maths.
Yeah, so are you thinking like our current national curriculum?
Yes.
So I think, for me, whenever I'm working with teachers or I'm thinking about the national curriculum, it might sound really obvious, but I do always go back to the 3 aims of the national curriculum. I think quite often as a classroom teacher, I would really just focus on the objectives of my year group, but then, and would quite often avoid the other aspects of what was in the national curriculum document. So I do try and take anyone that I'm working with back to those 3 aims and really encourage them to focus on unpicking what those aims are. If you think about this one talks about become fluent in the fundamentals of mathematics, and I think within that it talks about conceptual understanding, and then it also talks about that ability to recall and apply knowledge rapidly. And I think quite often there can be a bit of a misconception that fluency does just mean that procedural knowledge and that ability to rapidly recall facts. And I think also on the flip side, sometimes teachers might, particularly with teaching for mastery in the way that things have developed over the past few years, there might be an over-reliance on conceptual understanding. And I think it's really about that balance, isn't it? That we've got the conceptual understanding, but there's also, children also have those facts that they can recall rapidly, which will help them with, more trickier problems as they progress through school. So I think, encouraging teachers to look at that particular aim. And then I think also that second aim where we're talking about reason mathematically, teachers know that reasoning is a key focus of mathematics, and they know it's important. But again, when you really drill down into what's being asked of you, it's really quite challenging. You know, it talks about following a line of inquiry, and again, I think sometimes there's that tendency to rush through the curriculum, and we've got so much to cover. Do we actually allow enough time for children to follow a line of inquiry and see that maths is curious? There's lots to it. There's open, they can collaborate, and I think for me, I always really come back to that middle one about reason mathematically, and then likewise it talks about conjecturing relationships and making generalizations, and I think that is something that I know when I was starting off in my career, I probably wouldn't
Kate,
have even
your Wi-Fi is
thought that was
dropping
a
again, I'm afraid.
skill.
John,
I
I don't know whether you can
necessarily
hear okay your end.
focused in on it, whereas now I really, when I'm teaching a maths lesson, I think, what is it that children are going conjecturing this?
Okay. Thanks, Kate. Some really good. You're dropping out just a little bit. I don't know if you can get a little closer to your Wi-Fi, but I'll just pick up on some of the points that you made there. You mentioned about the kind of the question was about the national curriculum and the key features. You talked really well there about fluency in reason and problem solving. I mean, you and I have both been teaching long enough, I guess, to remember, only just mind to remember what the previous national curriculum were like. I actually can distinctly recall at the start of my career, kind of doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of everything in between. And then on Friday we did problem solving maths. And then, I guess one of the issues with that is we would be in a position where the children would think, well, on a Friday I solve problems, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday I don't necessarily solve problems. It might be that was focused on fluency. And I guess my next question, Kate, if you can get a little closer to your Wi-Fi if possible, is around kind of the impact that you think those three aims have had from the national curriculum, because although they're not new aims, and I think, fluency, reasoning and problem solving, making generalizations were in the previous curriculum, really it's about what is it about the design of the curriculum now that allows us to, I suppose, interweave them. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
I think Kate's just gone to try and sort her Wi-Fi out, John. So it might be a good time for me to say, welcome everybody, and thanks for listening. So we've got Lou, who I think potentially is a maths teacher in Wales, but my Welsh isn't as good as it used to be, so who knows. Hannah, Year 6 teacher in Madrid. Welcome, Hannah. Thanks for listening to this. Daniel as well. Welcome to TTR. I'll just bring Kate back in now, and we'll hope for the best that we can speak to her.
Thank you. Hi, Kate. Hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully you've managed to get reconnected there. I was just kind of summing up your previous point, and kind of the question was around the key features of the national curriculum for maths. And you mentioned there about fluency, reason, and problem solving. And while they're those concepts, those aims of the curriculum were built into the previous national curriculum, I was just saying we're kind of just about old enough to remember what the last national curriculum looks like and what the aims were there. But I wonder what your thoughts were about why the changes were made to the curriculum and kind of what impact that's had on the way in which we teach maths.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think changes were made, and I think at the time it felt like the changes were quite challenging. I don't know whether you would agree with that, John, but
I think what I was saying, Kate, and I don't know about you, but I can distinctly remember standing in my classroom on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and kind of cracking on with a maths lesson. And then suddenly Friday rocked around and I was doing problem solving Friday, as though we
Yeah,
only ever solve problems on a Friday.
yeah, yeah. I can remember those vividly as well. Yeah.
So I think with the changes, I guess my question is around what do you think the shift has been with the national curriculum that has brought this real focus on fluency, reasoning, and problem solving generalizations, which isn't kind of Monday's fluency, Tuesday's reasoning, and then Friday we suddenly solve problems. What is it about this curriculum that makes it quite interwoven and connected?
I think it's just putting those at the forefront, isn't it? And having that equal weighting and like you said, not waiting until the end of the week to solve problems. You know, problem solving is a really integral part of the curriculum, and you know, it should be within every single lesson, and that's what the curriculum's aiming to do, isn't it? It's actually to make children really well-rounded mathematicians and experts in their subject, and not just human computers that can, you know, answer simple questions, really, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I think it's a distant memory now. It seems like so long ago with the old curriculum, but actually the aims are really kind of noble aims. Really, we want children to be fluent. We want children to be able to reason. We want children to be able to solve problems. Okay, so kind of let's start and focus this in a little bit. We spoke about kind of the national curriculum, some of the changes that are attached to that. How can we know there's lots of well-known resources out there. My question is around kind of how can teachers use resources to support the teaching of mathematics?
I think it's about knowing what resource you want to and how you want it to support you. So, you know, is it from a day-to-day teaching perspective of being able to plan lessons? You know, there's really well-known schemes out there which offer lots of free resources to support teachers with that. And I think again, you know, you talked about when we first qualified as teachers, it seems like we've come on so far to what was originally there. You know, I remember, was it Primary Resources, that website and TES, and that was literally that was the only thing that was there to support us, really. Whereas now there is such a wealth of really high quality resources, and lots of them, you know, kind of really linked together nicely in terms of that teaching for mastery. And they're free, aren't they? You know, which is absolutely great for teachers. So I think it's about, what are they looking for? So well-known schemes that support you with that day-to-day planning. There's other websites which would maybe go into subject knowledge and really drill down into a particular topic or concept. So, you know, if you're new to teaching or you're new to a year group, or, you know, actually you just want to brush up on your own subject knowledge, there's resources available that will support you with that. If you're looking at developing problem solving and that following a line of inquiry, again, you know, really, I don't know what I'm allowed to mention and what I'm not allowed to mention, but really well-known website which would support you with that. So actually, if that is an area that you're struggling or you're not quite sure what that could look like, you know, there's those things. And then I think, you know, other resources which are a bit more generic but still support you in terms of mathematics. If you think about the work of the EAF, for example, so if you're new to leading maths or you're trying to get your head round what does really good mathematics look like and what does the evidence say, I would always encourage maths leaders to look at you know, what the EAF suggests. And then there's other non-statutory guidance that the DFE provide. The document I keep coming back to time and time again is that Ready to Progress document and how that can be used. But I think, having said all of that, and this might be, you know, a question that you're going to ask, or I'll delve a bit deeper into, John, it's quite overwhelming how many great resources are out there. And I think I saw a recent teacher tap that mentioned, you know, teachers can spend between 1 and 3 hours looking at resources, and you know, is that because there's too much out there? I suppose I don't know.
I suppose in a way that's one of my follow-up questions, Kate, was going to be about the challenges of kind of with the over I don't know, there's kind of too many in a way. So how one of the challenges, one of the drawbacks, I suppose, is what you're saying is how do teachers actually choose the resource that they want to use to match their intention in their classrooms? Based on kind of your conversations with some of your colleagues that you work with, Kate, what do you think kind of the biggest drawback is, and kind of what conversations are you having with people where people say, yeah, that's great, and we would love to do that, and then it's always followed with a but. And what do you think the real issues there are?
Yeah, I think if you particularly think about like teaching for mastery, and there's approved textbook schemes, and there's other really well known schemes of learning that teach a lot of teachers that I work with tend to use one or the other of those. And I think with that, you really need to invest in your staff and have that constant collaboration and that CPD opportunity. Those schemes and those textbooks are absolutely amazing. There's no disputing that. But I think, and this comes down to time, which is always a barrier, isn't it? But I think when we get the best out of teachers is when they can really engage with those resources and have that opportunity to unpick the mathematics within those resources and be able to collaborate. We saw that in Shanghai, didn't we? That actually the best lessons and the best knowledge comes from really discussing what's being taught and how you're using what you're using to teach what you want to teach, really.
Yeah, and when we went to Shanghai, Kate, we saw some expertly put together maths lessons, and I came back, and I think we both came back thinking we want to replicate that, and I just I've never been able to match kind of their quality of a maths lesson, and I think I'd agree with you. Time and kind of an overcrowded curriculum are one of the things which can really hold back. But you touched on there some really well known schemes have thought very carefully about how the curriculum's kind of put together and connected. And in some cases, you could be teaching addition and subtraction, but actually that links somehow to statistics or geometry or calculating perimeter in area. So I think being really careful about curriculum design can go quite a long way. Now I've said that, I don't know if that's a positive thing or if that's one of the challenges. It's probably, to be honest, it's probably a bit of both. With that in mind, and just thinking about kind of your current role at the minute, Kate, it was in the news recently, and it was kind of unavoidable in a way that lots of children really struggled. I mean, in their SATs, particularly with the reading. But I've had a look at the maths ones, and I administered some of the maths one, and the reasoning paper too. A lot of children were telling me when we could discuss it on Monday when they were released that actually they found them really, really challenging. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about kind of why do you think children, we've got teaching for mastery in school, and in some schools it's really well embedded. Why do some children then still really struggle with mathematics?
I think we can't ignore the impact of COVID and the pandemic, and the amount of lost learning or home learning that occurred, and we know that actually children in classrooms is the best possible kind of start in terms of providing those positive outcomes that we want. So I think if we think about those year 6 children, they've had a really turbulent key stage 2 in that sense in terms of COVID. And I think, having said that, teachers have worked really hard to address those gaps, and have absolutely kind of soldiered on and done the absolute best that they possibly can. But it's just really hard to make up that time, isn't it? And if you think about what children learn in year 3 and year 4, a lot of what SATS is assessing in year 6 links back to that year 3 and that year 4 and that year 5 curriculum. So I think that's obviously one of the things that stands out. And I also think I looked briefly at the SATS papers, but I do need to look at them in more detail. I think what stands out for me was there's some really unusual questions in terms of how they're presented. And I think, in a teaching for mastery context, we would say that they're a non-standard representation. And I think there's a lot more work that we can do to upskill teachers in what that could look like in their day-to-day lessons. I think that's probably an area that would improve how children respond to SATs. And I think, frustratingly, SATs happens in May, doesn't it? And there's, I always think there's 2 more months worth of teaching that can quite often be lost because of SATs in May. So I think that's also a challenge or frustration that teachers would face.
You mentioned there about kind of upskilling teachers. What would that look like, and how could that be done, do you think, Kate, given all of the pressures and constraints on schools?
Yeah, there's no magic wand in that sense, is there, unfortunately. And I think, it is trying to be done through the Teaching for Mastery programme and that collaboration between schools and, within local maths hubs. I think that is trying to be done. And I think, again, the resources that are out there really provide opportunities for teachers to see examples of what that might look like. And I think also, I looked at one of the questions and I read an analysis on one of the questions, and it said children need to be able to do this, this, and this, and there was about maybe 8 points that children needed to be able to do to answer the question. And I'm not disputing that as a point that was made. I do agree, but I actually just looked at the question and I could see it. And I think I don't want that to sound like, big-headed, but I think teaching for mastery actually starts to train your brain in a way that you can see the maths without getting bogged down in a series of procedures or in a series of, well, I must know this and I must know this and I must connect it all, because actually it's almost like that light bulb moment, isn't it? Yeah.
I think you're right, and a lot of schools that I have worked with, a lot of colleagues that I've worked with, are kind of they get hung up on every lesson has to have some kind of manipulative or some kind of something physical in the class, and that absolutely it's one of the hallmarks of teaching for mastery and of really effective teaching and learning. But actually, what I think what we've got to remember is the ultimate aim of teaching for mastery is to not actually use any of the equipment or any of the mathematical manipulatives. And I think, and I don't know about your experience, Kate, but I think for me that sometimes gets a little bit lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost like that tick box, isn't it? That if I've got manipulatives, I'm doing teaching for mastery. And I think it's that really careful choice of what manipulative or what representation am I going to use for children to be able to see the structure of the mathematics or to understand the mathematics and not do the mathematics. I remember quite a few years ago, I was working with a school, maybe going off topic a little bit, but it is linked. And children were doing short division, and they were using place value counters to help them. And the place value counters were all muddled up, so it wasn't as if they were even using hundreds in the 100 column. They were just placing these place value counters in a column, and they knew they had to exchange, but they didn't really understand what was going on. And it was kind of a really standout moment that this teacher knew that manipulatives were a good thing, but they were being used in a really procedural way. So actually, it made no difference to children just being taught a procedure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and do you think that comes from a place of subject knowledge, or maybe he or she has sat in some training that said you need to have manipulatives out, and it kind of becomes one of those things that becomes a bit of a tick box, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's been a real investment in schools in terms of providing manipulatives and lots of discussion around using them. And I think it just needs that extra CPD, doesn't it, as to why are you using them and what does that mean in the context for teaching for mastery. And I go back to Shanghai again. Actually we saw very little manipulatives being used, but actually saw really careful representations being used, and that was the key, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it always, for me, it always came back to revealing the structure of maths concepts that was being taught. It wasn't just, oh, well, I'm going to use a bar model because that's what I've been told to do. It was really carefully thought out. And I think, what I was touching on earlier is, yes, we would love to replicate that perhaps in this country and have that kind of approach, but in a packed curriculum where primary school teachers in particular are teaching upwards of 25 lessons a week, it's really hard to set aside kind of the time, the focus to think, why is it that I'm teaching this in the way in which I'm going to teach it? And I guess that's the power, like you say, Kate, of some really well thought out and well-known schemes that are kind of out there. But even with that, teachers need to be discerning and make their own choices and have a real kind of rationale, I suppose, as to why they're teaching things in a particular way. Okay. Sorry, go on, Kate.
No, I just said absolutely. I was just, with you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm just going to read out a little note from the sponsor, and then we'll jump straight in. So this program is brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. A clinically approved, ready to go wellbeing and mental health program will help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes a day. You'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, you can visit them at www.happyconfident.com. So I'm with Kate Henschel, and we're talking all things kind of maths, teaching for March through tonight. And we've just been talking about some of the issues kind of facing maths education, and some really useful things from Kate there that she's had experience in, and some of the challenges as well to do with teaching maths. So Kate, in an ideal world, I want you to imagine you're kind of the new education secretary. You've got full control over maths. What's the first thing that you do on day one to improve maths in England? Now, that's a huge question. I know.
It's a huge question.
But you've got 3 seconds to think of an answer.
I think there's already a lot of great things going on. I think it is really hard. It's really easy, isn't it, to get bogged down sometimes as teachers in the negativity. I think, retention, pay rises, etc., etc. We won't delve into that tonight. And I think I would continue to invest in the Maths Hub programme, because I think that brings great free CPD to teachers. And, I go back to when I first qualified. Apart from your local authority network meeting, there was absolutely nothing that kind of rivaled that level of support that was free for schools. So I would, thankfully, there is continued investment into that programme. So that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I think then also what I would love to do, and you've touched a lot on it, you keep saying a packed curriculum, and I feel like you're possibly reading my mind a little bit, John, but I would really love to look at the curriculum and I think, really kind of rewrite it in a way, I suppose. I think there's a lot that's expected of children in Key Stage 1, and I think, SATs in Year 2, even though that's going to change next year, and, moderation and task statements, I don't think that particularly helps teachers to cover the curriculum in Key Stage 1 well, because there's those outside pressures which can quite often encourage teachers to move through the curriculum at pace rather than really focusing on what the children need. So I would absolutely strip back that curriculum, particularly in Key Stage 1, and then really think about Key Stage 2 and that overlap to Key Stage 3. We do quite a lot of work with, I've worked with Key Stage 3 practitioners, and I think they can't quite believe sometimes that overlap between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. So, I think that's wouldn't be done on day one, definitely, but, it'd take quite a while, wouldn't it? But I would definitely look at that.
Yeah, thank you. I think yeah, it's an interesting point about kind of the expectations in Year 6 and then the expectations in Year 7 around the curriculum. But just kind of rewinding a little bit to kind of before you become an early career teacher, what would your thoughts on kind of improvements for teacher training, universities, skits, and what do you think could be done to bridge the gap even further to improve kind of the way in which maths is taught in that way?
Yeah, I think I would love for trainee teachers to spend, particular, I did a PGCE, and I think some people might have had a better experience than I did, but I don't think it prepared me enough for that day one, with my first ever class. And I don't think it provided me with the subject knowledge that I needed. So I think looking at those pathways to becoming a teacher and how do they really support, particularly primary schools where we are a jack of all trades and we don't necessarily focus in on one subject. What is going on to develop teachers, not just their subject knowledge and not just their pedagogical knowledge, but that pedagogical content knowledge, knowing how you can actually be the best maths teacher, like what is the best way to teach this particular concept, or likewise, how is that different to teaching a concept in science, for example. So I think there's definitely more that could be done at that level on really focusing on how best to teach a particular concept, not just how to teach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you've just reminded me there, speaking of science, the links between, and I'm looking for some top tips really here, Kate. The link between Ofsted had published a report, and I remember reading in the report about the links between maths and science. I don't know if you've had any kind of thoughts as to what that might look like, how far you might be down the line with your thinking or discussions. You may well have not given it much thought at all, but I'm just interested in kind of what your thinking is around that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a clear link, isn't there, between the two subjects, and I think I've definitely not had that much time to think about that question in particular, but I think it's that curriculum again, isn't it? How is what we're learning in mathematics going to support us with the skills that we also need in science? So are we learning things in science that we haven't yet learned, foundational skills in maths that would support us with that? So I think that really clear, or that better alignment between what's going on in maths and what's going on in science, I think that would really kind of transform the two, and making those clear links, like you said, really.
I think one of the challenges with that, Kate, would be kind of, I'd be interested in your thoughts around this, but would it not be kind of the sequencing? Because you wouldn't want to teach something in science and assume that children can do a scatter graph or, a bar chart if it hasn't been formally taught in maths.
Absolutely, and I think it's making that really clear, isn't it? Quite a lot of analysis that's done in science, or the way that we might present our findings to investigations, does heavily rely on those, or how we might measure things, does heavily rely on those mathematical skills. And I think sometimes we might not be clear on that alignment of have children actually learnt this yet in maths. Yeah, and I think that needs to be made really clear to support teachers.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to think about, isn't it? And it's kind of, I guess, I work in a small school, and a couple of weeks ago I was talking to a head teacher on the show who was head teacher of a small school, and she said one of the more challenging things is, this person was on board with teaching for mastery. She had put quite a lot of time and effort into trying to develop a staff, but one of the drawbacks was getting teachers to work together, and finding time to release them, and schools are very busy, quite complicated places to remain operational at the best of times, particularly at the moment. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's about careful sequencing and making those links and making those connections. And unfortunately, we don't have a magic wand in which to do that. All right. Thanks, Kate. The next kind of thing, I'm going to kind of refocus this back into just purely maths, and I think this will be kind of a question. We spoke about kind of the curriculum at large, and then we've brought it right down to what effective teaching and learning looks like, pedagogy, and now I'd be interested in your thinking, Kate, around what you think the benefits of teaching for mastery as an approach are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think for me, it's having that focus on making sure children are really secure with a particular concept or their understanding before moving on, and not being afraid to really go into depth about a concept and make sure that children have that deep knowledge that is going to be sustained before moving them on too quickly. I think again, we've talked a lot about curriculum and teachers feeling like they have to cover that curriculum and they have to rush through it. But I would always say, actually, focus on that depth of knowledge rather than speeding through. I think Debbie Morgan always talks about, kind of slowing it down, because that will end up, children will end up understanding it much better. And I think there's some merit with that kind of thought, really. I think also for me, teaching for mastery is it's almost kind of simple almost, and that simplicity really supports children to have that clarity of understanding. It's you're exploring a concept in a lot of detail, which then makes it really easy to understand. I don't know whether you would agree with that, John.
Yeah, I think that it's both very complicated and very simple all at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, my experiences of it is that it it really does support all learners, and it's about kind of removing those barriers, or actually that belief that actually all children can achieve and will have that opportunity to. So I've only ever experienced positive things with a teaching for mastery approach. I think this.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, go and ask your question.
I'm just going to ask, just for those listening, Kate, or those who kind of download the podcast and things, kind of, would you be able to go into what teaching for mastery actually is, the 5 principles of teaching for mastery? Because some of the listeners may well not teach in England, for example. It could be that Tom had mentioned someone's in from Madrid. Just kind of, what is teaching for mastery? What does it look like?
We also weirdly have a lot of listeners in Iran and India and also Sweden. So welcome to everyone from those countries if you happen to be listening back to this.
Okay.
We welcome you.
Kate.
Goodbye.
No pressure, Kate. So the question was around kind of what, in terms of teaching for mastery, what does it mean? What does it kind of look like? What are the principles behind it?
Yes, there's definitely different interpretations or explanations, but I think for me, I would come back to those 5 principles that we see through the NCETM and the Maths Hub programme. So really thinking about coherence running throughout, so that ability to have small pedagogical steps, or breaking concepts down into smaller steps so that children can really understand it. And when we're talking about coherence, that it might be across a series of lessons, it might be across a unit of work, it might be within a lesson, it might even be one aspect of a lesson. So it's not just thinking about a coherent curriculum, it's really thinking about that concept and how you're teaching that coherently.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think you've got representation and structure. We've talked quite a bit about representations and structures, but that careful choice, how is the maths being represented, and what structure of maths am I trying to uncover, or are children trying to understand? And I think that's a real big one, isn't it? That understanding of representation and structure. And I suppose links to, concrete pictorial abstract approach that's quite familiar to a lot of teachers. But it's not just that. I think quite often language gets missed out as a representation, and I'm quite passionate about mathematical language. And then you've got mathematical thinking, so making those connections and being able to reason and spot patterns and make those generalizations. We touched on that earlier. Then fluency, we've talked a little bit about that. So not just seeing fluency as being able to recall facts, but having that flexibility, and knowing when you're going to choose a particular method, so you're not just relying on one method. So I think there's more to fluency than just what meets the eye sometimes. And then finally, variation, which we talk about conceptual variation and procedural variation. And I think teachers can get quite bogged down in those two things. But ultimately, I think, how are you representing the mathematics? Are you showing it in different ways? We talked earlier about seeing maths in non-standard ways. So not just seeing it in a way that's quite familiar, but also looking at it in a non-standard way, and thinking about those examples and those non-examples. I think when I was first introduced to that aspect of teaching for mastery, the use of non-examples was a real eye-opener for me. And I think actually it's one of the things that really supports children to understand the actual example that you want them to understand. So I suppose that's kind of in a snapshot. I'm not sure I've done it justice there, John. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add, really.
Yeah, I think you've covered the basics of kind of what teaching for mastery is for those that mightn't be familiar with it. You did touch on something there, Kate, that I would like to pick up on, and you mentioned about mathematical vocabulary and language, and it's kind of something that you're really interested in. I've obviously been to quite a few of your conferences where you've around this, and I'm just wondering, kind of, in your opinion and with your expertise, what do you think the best way for teachers to teach maths vocabulary is?
Oh, yeah, that's that's a really good question. I think there's a lot of steps that would need in place, or things that you need to do to build up to children maybe generalizing and using that mathematical language. I think you need that awareness of what math language you're going to use and why you're going to use it. So having the confidence to use that precise language initially, and I think making those decisions. We talk about, in teaching for mastery, add-end and add-end equals sum. And for some teachers, that's really new, and they might have a bit of an anxiety towards that. And I think it's about knowing what you want to do in your lesson and what's appropriate for your children. But I think also not being scared to use that language. We see it all the time in other lessons. Science. I always go back to this example in science. If we're talking about translucent, opaque, and transparent, we wouldn't let the children say see through, a little bit see through, and not see through. We would expect them to use those precise language. So I think it's about knowing what words you want the children to use in those maths lessons. And I think not being afraid to model that or correct that. I've been in quite a few lessons this week, actually, and I've heard things like top number, bottom number, big hand, little hand. And it's so easy to fall into that trap because we want to help children. We want to make it easy and accessible. But I think don't be afraid to follow that up with what those words actually mean mathematically. And then I think, giving children frames for talking and frames for thinking. So thinking about those, first of all, those sentence openers, so that children start to speak in full sentences, and then moving that into STEM sentences where, they become more mathematical and are there really kind of to support children to understand a mathematical concept. And then ultimately, hopefully, allow children to build up to generalising mathematically.
Brilliant. For those that are not familiar, Kate, could you just talk around what a STEM sentence is, what its use is?
Yeah, so I think for me, a STEM sentence would be used in the maths lesson to kind of help understand a mathematical concept. So if you're thinking about how many tens are in 100, you would have, there are tens in 100, and children would fill in the blanks, and then maybe use that in another context, or kind of change some of the words if the concept changed slightly. So that would be my very quick off the cuff definition.
But I think one of the things that struck me there, Kate, about vocabulary, and it made me really think of I teach in year 6 at the moment. It made me really think of children when they kind of are presented with a question on the SATs paper or any kind of assessment. One of the children put their hands up and said, "Oh, Mr. B, it's asking for the product. What's that?"
Mm-hmm.
And I'm quite up on kind of using the key vocabulary and things like that and being really precise with the children. But even then, if it's not embedded across the whole school, it can become quite lost, because children very quickly learn that, oh, well, it's just the answer. But I think you're right. I think it is about being really specific and trying to use it in lots of different ways, like you say, Kate. Yeah, thank you. I think there's lots there to really think about with the teaching for mastery approach. Loads of advantages, and I think I've recently heard someone, Kate, and I don't know if you agree with this, that vocabulary is kind of the hidden principle behind everything. It links in with the coherence, the representation and structure, fluency, variation, theory, and the ability to think mathematically. You can't do any of those really without using the correct mathematical vocabulary. So I think it is a really good point in which to pick up on. We've got maybe 20 minutes or so left. I'm just going to quickly kind of work through the next part. We're going to talk about kind of how we're going to touch on parents, how they can support. But before we do, just a quick message from our sponsor. So this program is brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Their clinically approved, ready to go wellbeing and mental health program will help your pupils thrive in only 10 minutes. You'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, you can visit them at www.happyconfident.com. All right, thank you, Kate. I'm just about to kind of touch on, we spoke about teaching for mastery and kind of what it is, what it looks like, and how teachers can kind of get the most out of it. One of the things you touched on Shanghai earlier, one of the things that struck me when I went to Shanghai is they use the same curriculum, which in schools that perhaps parents of the children in that room would have had a very similar, if not the same curriculum. Obviously, we know that isn't something which is the same in our education system in England. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on some of the things that parents might be able to do to support children.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky for some parents, isn't it? Because they learned maths in a different way, or they might have been taught completely different to how our children are taught at the moment. I think quite often some of the parents that I've encountered have a real anxiety towards mathematics, and again, it's come up recently in the news and from the government, isn't it, that parents sometimes don't feel afraid of saying that they didn't like maths or they weren't good at maths, but we wouldn't hear that about reading or writing necessarily. So I think for some parents it's really hard maybe to admit that they've got a bit of an anxiety or they struggle with maths. I think there's lots of things out there that would support parents. We've talked about really well-known schemes. The one I'm particularly thinking of as a whole section on their website that's accessible for parents, and I think that that's a really great starting point. But go and find out what it is that your children are learning and how they're learning. Don't be afraid to ask school to look at how maths is taught. I think for me, in one of my previous schools that I worked in, and I know this is more what the schools can do rather than what the parents can do, but we really welcomed parents into school. We hosted meetings so that we could show parents how the maths was taught. We had regular opportunities for parents to look in books, and I think that really helped and kind of alleviated the myth around how maths is taught. So anything that like that parents can get involved with, I think I would definitely recommend. Absolutely.
I think you're right. I think with parents, Kate, they can quite often, the maths anxiety kind of trickles down and into them, and it kind of it almost can feel hereditary at some point, you know. Their parents weren't very good at maths, therefore the assumption that parents can make is that they're not going to be very good at maths. I've certainly came across that a few times. Um, I'm kind of wondering, you touched on there about maths anxiety. So flipping that on its head, we spoke about what parents can possibly do. What can schools do in terms of supporting children who quite clearly have maths anxiety and feel really nervous about attempting math? And this might tie in actually with what you were saying about teaching for mastery.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work that I do is, linked to like the Maths Hub. Is we look at that growth mindset and mathematical mindsets and really unpick what that actually means. And I think there's lots of things that can happen without necessarily realizing that might maybe reinforce anxiety or might kind of encourage children to have a fear of maths. So if you think about, the big one, testing and assessment, how what happens in a school that might kind of increase that anxiety. So, if children are being tested on something that they haven't yet learned, what impact could that have, and what messages go alongside that? Is it that there's no discussion, and children are presented with a test and they kind of just have to do it in silence, and they're faced with questions that are completely unfamiliar? Or is it, we're going to do a test and it's okay, like this is to help me learn what you know? So I think the messages around testing is a really big thing that I would look at.
Mhm.
Also, again, I reflect on my own practice. I remember when I was teaching in the Northeast, I had a year 3 class, and I had a real, weirdly, and I'm not saying this is always the case, I had a group of girls that just really did not want to take part in maths lessons. And I think it's easy as a teacher to ask the children that are more engaged or more eager or have their hands up. And for me, we did a whole chunk of work on, actually, I want to hear what you're thinking, and it might not be a full answer, it might not be the right answer, it might just be a bit of an instinct. And you genuinely might not know, and all of those things are okay, but I don't know unless you share that with me. And I think, by the end of the year, those kind of group of girls really turned it round. And other things that I've noticed as well, is those children that have those coping strategies. So, if you're doing whiteboard work, they'll be looking at somebody else's, and then maybe copying it down, so that they kind of learning the behaviors that they need to do to survive and go under the radar. But it's really looking out for those as a teacher and thinking, how can I address that, or how can I support that child, to avoid that, really. Yeah, and I think the praise that goes alongside that, are we looking for children that are giving the right answers? Are we looking for children that are kind of persevering and working things out and giving it a go?
Yeah, and I think it's obviously we could probably spend a full hour and a half talking just about maths anxiety, really, and different approaches and ways in which it can be addressed and strategies. But really, I think what you might be getting at there, Kate, is it's about a culture and embedding a real culture of acceptance of mistakes. And in many ways, that's bigger than maths. That's a whole kind of school issue, but it's possibly even bigger than that. It's a societal issue, and kind of trying to get your head around, kind of like you say, that maths isn't just for boys, or and English is for girls, because there's that gender debate as well around maths. And once you start and unpick this, I guess I'm always left with more questions than perhaps answers.
Yeah, and I think you asked earlier about parents, and I think linked to that, I think, when, and it's slightly different now, I suppose, because we've got the digital age, and there's more things that children do digitally. But for me, growing up, we would regularly play a board game, most weeks, or I'd play cards with my grandma, my granddad. And it was that real kind of those skills that were developed through that. So being able to take turns, being able to make a mistake or not win the game, or be the last one. And I think some of those skills really kind of transpire into maths, that actually you need to know about turn taking, you need to know about, thinking about the best way that you could win, for example, and that kind of out of the box thinking, or knowing that it's okay to make a mistake, or actually this time you might not have won that round, but you might win it next time. And I think a lot of that comes from those games that we would have played younger, and maybe not all children have that opportunity as much because of other entertainment through digital devices, for example.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think perhaps it's something that schools could try and build into their curriculum around the use of board games and all of those transferable skills, like you're saying. And that's I suppose what I'm getting at. In a way, it's bigger than just maths. It's a whole kind of a real cultural shift. Of course, we still want children to have the digital skills, but we also want them to have, I suppose, I'm going to make myself sound really old now, Kate, but the traditional skills of
Yeah.
turn taking and being able to engage with someone and really reason with someone. And I think, with the rise of artificial intelligence, it's kind of, where does that fit in the huge picture of kind of the world, and then the curriculum and what actually happens in classrooms. So it's a huge thing, I think, when you start and unpick kind of maths anxiety. And I think it's one of those subjects, I think you're right, Kate, it's one of those subjects that runs really deep with people. And you say to someone, you might talk about another curriculum area, but as soon as you start talking about maths, you're dead on. If people have had problems when they were younger with maths or kind of anxieties, they're very quick to tell you and kind of want no further involvement in it. And I, what the good work that you're doing will be changing hearts and changing minds, I'm sure.
Yeah.
With that in mind, Kate, I'm just wondering, you mentioned about the EEF earlier, and obviously the research that comes along that, and I'm wondering, kind of just from your work, the research which they've published, or any other research that you've referred to, what do you think? How do you think teachers can kind of digest that research, and what does that actually mean for day-to-day practice in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of things out there that support teachers to digest the research, isn't there? They can get involved with the Maths Hub, they can get involved with the research school, they can attend, research events. There's lots of things that happen where there's real life teachers talking about how they're using research in their practice. And again, I think that's been a real shift, particularly when I first started teaching. There was nothing like that really to support you. You would have an academic paper, and that was pretty much, that's what you were left with. So you were then left to kind of interpret that and engage whether it was reliable or not, or whereas now there's so much more tangible research that you can easily engage with. I think what I would suggest is to not be overwhelmed. Again, there's more things out there, but does that make it more overwhelming? And I think, you talked there, or I did as well, about the EEF and, some of the research linked to the maths, the guidance reports. They are quite overwhelming, but I think keep coming back to it. Or, I talk to maths leaders about this and think, what's your action plan, or what are your priorities for this year? And then how does that maybe link to the guidance or the recommendations? And, don't get bogged down in thinking that you have to do all of those things or change everything at once. Maybe just look at one thing and look at it well, and spend time to understand it. So I think, don't think that, Rome wasn't built in a day. So don't think that everything needs to be changed in that sense. But I also think for quite a lot of maths leaders, particularly in primary, they don't necessarily have that time to engage with quite detailed reports. So be brave and ask for that time, because otherwise, how can you improve your subject? How can you keep up to date with the most recent advice, or the most recent guidance, or the most recent recommendations? So I think, be brave in terms of asking for a bit of time, and state what you're going to do with that time. Actually, I want to look at this because I want to do this and this, and I think that's a really kind of reasonable request from a maths leader, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to do it now, like you say, with maths hubs and all kinds of research schools. But the EEF for people who are not familiar, the Education Endowment Foundation can be a really good free starting point to really get people thinking about some of the strategies and ways in which they can begin to really develop their subject area and in a really sort of accessible way. It doesn't really go into the methodology. It kind of gives busy teachers the highlights and ways in which you can drive things forward. So yeah, I think that's some really interesting things there to be thinking about. In terms of the next kind of part, Kate, it links right back to the beginning of when we started our discussion about kind of, if you could, we talked about if you were education secretary for what would you do on day one? But I want to kind of refocus that question just before we finish in the next 10 minutes or so. Kind of, if you could design your own maths curriculum, what would you do? Why would you do it? What would it look like?
Oh, that's such a hard question. I would really love to have, like, I don't want to say discovery learning because I feel like people take that out of context, but I think, kind of posing a problem or posing a question, and I suppose it's a bit like teaching from maths, posing a question to children or posing a problem and encouraging them to tackle it, see what they do first, and then be very clear in how I would then teach that concept, or how we would unpick any misconceptions. And I think a curriculum that would support teachers to do that, rather than just a set of objectives, which is what we've got, isn't it? We've got an overwhelming amount of objectives. Actually, what does that look like? And yeah, and I think just bring a bit more of that creativity and flexibility back with being able to really explore something in more detail. We talked about problem solving Friday, and whilst it was awful, actually having a whole chunk of time to be able to explore something and look at it in different ways, I think is really useful. And I think Teaching for Mastery definitely tries to do that, but I think it's that balance of how much we've got to cover in the curriculum. So yeah, I don't know whether that is just kind of saying things we've already talked about, but that's what I would want.
Yeah, so more kind of inquiry based.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, what are your thoughts around how that might fit with Teaching for Mastery? Do you feel like it could fit, or would it be too big a jump?
No, I think it would fit. I think it's just how that looks in terms of a national curriculum, and I think the only way that it would fit is if we really stripped it back, like we spoke about at the beginning of the session this evening. Is stripping back those objectives and I think providing guidance on what that could look like.
Yeah, I think kind of, for me, if I was designing my curriculum, it would be quite similar to your thoughts there, Kate, around kind of some lessons you feel when you're teaching for mastery, you are going in really deep, but kind of a problem solving approach, I think, might allow for greater independence and might actually go some way to push aside some of the maths anxiety, because one of the things that some might say about Teaching for Mastery is it's a bit too scaffolded for children. It's kind of over teaching them in a way so that they're really secure. And perhaps one way that we could counteract that would be through, I can't believe I'm actually saying these words out loud, but it could be through a Friday problem solving day. I've kind of gone full circle in my thinking here. Perhaps, I suppose it wouldn't always have to be on a Friday, and we would have to be mindful that we do actually want problem solving to be woven throughout every lesson that we do, with reasoning, with fluency, and it not to become, on Friday we do problem solving. I guess that would be the danger.
No, I completely agree, and I think you know, again, going back to our curriculum, it talks about, you know, routine problem solving and non-routine problems. And I think we don't do enough of non-routine problems where we're really kind of developing children's reasoning power, or, you know, promoting that resilience within them. And, you know, actually, if you think about some of the world's most famous mathematicians or scientists, they were those non-routine problem solvers, weren't they? They were finding the answers that we needed to find. You know, you think about people like Edison, you know, he kept trying and one day it just worked for him in terms of the light bulb. So I think that's what I would love maths to look like. And maybe that links to the question you said earlier about the link between science and mathematics. I think, how can we make more kind of creative thinkers, problem solvers, engineers, inventors, I suppose, through maths?
Thank you, Kate. I think just to finish off, and I know this is something that you've been working on quite recently from your social media, and I'm just wondering, kind of just to finish, what's the best way that teachers can just to, you know, there's no kind of segue into it, it's not linked to anything that we've just said, but what's the best way to kind of teach multiplication facts for children? I'm just mindful that the multiplication times table check is looming.
Yeah, really interesting question. So this is one of the things I've been exploring with a group of schools that I've been working with through our local maths hub. And there's kind of two schools of thought, really, from what we've looked at. You know, somebody out there might prove me wrong, and I'm definitely open to people challenging me or providing me with new things that I've not yet discovered. So is it that we just teach children to kind of learn the facts rotely and kind of recite them, or do we have that real focus on connections and, you know, if you know 3 times 4, how can you use that to work out 4 times 4, for example? Maybe a bad example there, but just thinking off the top of my head. And I think there's definitely arguments for both, that you need children to make those connections. But I think quite a bit of the research, or a bit of the things that we've looked into, is that, you know, that chanting and that kind of verbal chant really supports children to learn times table facts. And I think if you ask a lot of us how we learned facts, then, you know, it was through chanting or it was through singing. So we've been doing a lot of kind of work on that, and looking at a lot of what Claire Christie promotes in terms of how she teaches times tables. I think actually she's developing a program to support teachers with that. So it's about really looking at that clear progression. So which times tables are we introducing? Looking at stripping that down. If you think about, we have to learn up to 12 times 12, but actually there's probably 36 key facts. The ready to progress criteria has a really nice kind of diagram which highlights those 36 key facts. And then once you've got that highlighted, it's really obvious that because of other things like commutativity, we don't, you know, if we know 2 times 3, we know 3 times 2, for example.
Yeah.
And again, you know, looking at things that are really obvious, like the 1 times table, the 10 times table, you know, they've got just really clear rules or clear patterns. So then that allows us to focus really on the 2 times table right up to the 9 times table. And then one of the big things that we've been looking at is that chant sequence and saying the larger number first. So 7 2s are 14, and it just rolls off your tongue, and encouraging children not to like use their fingers or get bogged down with counting, but actually to just be able to recite it. And that verbal chanting and repetition supports with that recall. So that's one of the ways we've been looking at and seeing if it actually works or not. So yeah.
Some really interesting thoughts, insights there, Kate. It's been wonderful to talk with you tonight. Thank you ever so much for joining us, and I know all of the listeners would have taken so much away from tonight. And if they're anything like me, they've possibly got questions buzzing around their heads now. But that's the beauty of kind of having these conversations and really thinking in depth about what it is that we want for the children in our schools and what we want actually for the educators in our schools as well. Any final thoughts? Anything you feel like you would like to share with everyone, Kate?
I think it's just been a real pleasure to talk all things maths. You know, I am very passionate about the subject, and I always welcome other people's thoughts, reflections, challenges, or, you know, it's great to hear what people are working on. And I think, you know, for me, I like to think that I'm somebody that's constantly learning. So, you know, if there are things that I've said and people disagree with, feel free to come forward. Or if there are things that have stood out and you do agree with, likewise, it's really nice. So, yeah, always welcome to hear what other people think and what they're working on, because that's how we grow as a community of maths teachers, really.
Well, once again, it's been a real genuine pleasure to speak with you, Kate. It's so lovely to hear your voice and to hear all of the fantastic things that you've been up to. Thank you to everyone who has listened this evening, or if you're listening at a later time. I hope that you've had perhaps some answers and some things to think about. You can join us again at Teacher Talk Radio in 2 weeks' time, The Late Show with John B. And we look forward to seeing you all again on the 6th of June. Thanks ever so much, Kate. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.